It's 8:05 a.m. on a Tuesday. You tap your card for a coffee. It works. You swipe your badge to enter your office building. It works. You check your banking app while waiting for the elevator. The balance is there. You take this for granted. We all do. We assume that when we want our money, it's there. We assume that the digital plumbing behind the world economy is solid steel. But it isn't. On September 17, 2019, that plumbing almost exploded. It didn't make the front page of the New York Times. It wasn't a stock market crash. There were no guys in suits jumping out of windows. But inside the deepest, darkest engine room of Wall Street, panic set in. The interest rate that controls the price of money, which is supposed to stay boringly flat, suddenly went vertical. It spiked 400% in a matter of hours. Major banks stopped lending to each other. The gears of the financial system ground to a halt. If the Federal Reserve hadn't stepped in within minutes with a fire hose of billions of dollars, by 1 p.m. that afternoon, your debit card would have stopped working. By Wednesday, payroll systems would have frozen. By Friday, the global economy would have looked like a car that ran out of oil at 90 miles per hour. We aren't talking about the stock market. The stock market is just a casino where people bet on the outcome. We are talking about the repo market. It is the 24-hour pawn shop that keeps the lights on. And right now, it is signaling that something is very, very wrong. The mechanism, the pawn shop. Narrator. To understand why your bank account is actually safe or unsafe, you have to ignore the S&P 500. You need to look at the shadow banking system, specifically the Repurchase Agreement market, or Repo for short. This sounds complex. It's designed to sound complex so you don't ask questions, but it is actually stupidly simple. Imagine you run a massive hedge fund or a bank. You have $10 billion worth of US Treasury bonds in your vault. That looks great on a balance sheet. You're rich, but you have a problem. You can't use a Treasury bond to pay your electric bill. You can't use it to pay your trader's bonuses. You need cash, liquid, spendable cash. So every single night, you go to a pawn shop, a sleek, metaphorical pawn shop counter. A banker slides a bond across. A broker slides cash back. Narrator. You walk in, you hand over your US Treasury bond, your gold watch, to another bank that has extra cash lying around. They give you cash. You agree to come back the next morning, buy your bond back, and pay a tiny fee. That fee is the interest. That is the repo rate. This happens every night. Trillions of dollars of assets are pawned at sunset and bought back at sunrise. It is the grease that allows the multi-trillion-dollar engine of capitalism to spin. Usually, this pawn shop is boring. It's safe because everyone trusts the gold watch. Everyone trusts that a US Treasury bond is the safest asset in human history. But in 2019, the pawn shop ran out of money. Here is the uncomfortable truth about banking. Banks don't actually have that much money. They have assets, they have loans, they have IOUs. But actual cash reserves? That number is surprisingly thin. In September 2019, a perfect storm hit. Corporations had to withdraw massive amounts of cash to pay quarterly taxes. At the same time, the US government sold a huge batch of new debt, sucking even more cash out of the system. Suddenly, everyone rushed to the pawn shop window holding their gold watches. They needed cash to survive the night. But the window was closed. There were no lenders. In Economics 101, when demand is high and supply is zero, price goes to infinity. The interest rate to borrow cash overnight usually sits around 2%. By mid-morning, it hit 5%, then 8%, then 10%. You might think, who cares? So wealthy banks have to pay more interest. But you don't understand. A 10% overnight rate in the banking world is not expensive. It is fatal. It is a heart attack. If banks can't borrow cheap cash, they can't function. If they can't function, they stop processing payments. They stop lending to businesses. The contagion spreads from Wall Street to Main Street in less than 24 hours. The Federal Reserve saw this heart attack happening in real time. They panicked. They didn't wait for a vote. They didn't ask Congress. They fired up the money printer. The Fed stepped into the pawn shop, pushed the other lenders aside, and said, "We will buy everything." They injected hundreds of billions of dollars into the repo market overnight. They flooded the engine with oil to stop it from seizing. It worked. The rate came down, the ATMs stayed on, you got your coffee. But in doing so, they broke the fundamental rule of the free market. They proved that the system cannot survive on its own. It is on life support. If 2019 was a drought, what happened next was a flood. COVID hit. The government panicked again. They printed trillions of dollars in stimulus. The Fed printed trillions more to buy bonds. Suddenly, the banking system went from having no cash to drowning in it. You would think having too much money is a good thing, but in the weird upside-down logic of finance, it's a nightmare. Banks are required by law to hold capital against their deposits. If you deposit $1 million, the bank has to hold a certain amount of equity. When deposits flooded in from stimulus checks and tech company profits, banks were overwhelmed. They literally didn't have a place to put the money where it would earn a return. So, the pawn shop flipped. Visual, the previous pawn shop animation, but now running in reverse. The banker is shoving cash at the broker and begging for a bond. This is called the reverse repo. Instead of pawning a bond to get cash, banks started shoving cash at the Federal Reserve just to get rid of it overnight. They said, "Please take this $2 trillion. Give us some bonds to hold so we can earn a tiny 0.05% interest because the real economy is too risky to lend to." Look at the chart. Before 2021, the reverse repo usage was almost zero. By 2022, it was over $2.5 trillion every single night. Think about the absurdity of this. The Fed printed money to stimulate the economy. They gave it to the banks. The banks couldn't find anyone good to lend it to, so they lent it back to the Fed. It's a closed loop, a snake eating its own tail. The money never reached the small businesses or the infrastructure projects. It just sloshed back and forth in the pipes, creating the illusion of stability while inflation raged outside. The collateral crisis. Visual. A magnifying glass inspecting a U.S. Treasury bond. The edges look frayed or burnt. Narrator. But here is the real danger, the monster under the bed. The entire repo market, this 24-hour pawn shop, only works because of one assumption, that the gold watch, the U.S. Treasury bond, is worth what it says it is. It is the bedrock of the global financial system. It is considered risk-free. But look at the math. The U.S. national debt is flying past $34 trillion. We're adding $1 trillion every 100 days. The interest payments on that debt are now higher than our defense budget. The pawn shop is getting suspicious of the watch. In the financial world, when a pawnbroker doesn't trust the value of your item, they ask for a haircut. They say, "Sure, that bond says it's worth $100, but I'll only lend you $90 against it." If that happens to U.S. Treasuries, if the global market decides that American debt is actually risky, the system doesn't just slow down, it implodes. If the haircut in the repo market increases by even 1%, it wipes out hundreds of billions of dollars of leverage instantly. Hedge funds collapse, banks become insolvent, and unlike 2019, the Fed can't just print more money to fix it, because printing more money creates more inflation, which makes the bonds worth even less. It is a trap. We like to think of finance as a science. We think it's run by equations and algorithms. It isn't. It's run on confidence.